I'm glad to welcome you. Today I want to talk not about composition, but about the rules of narrative content. Even though the rules of composition and narrative content are different, the organization of the narrative material affects the composition, since the composition must introduce the story told in picture. The narrative content and composition must relate to each other in order to help the viewer read the picture. Let me remind you that the elements of composition are lines and spots on a plane, and the elements of narrative content are objects and figures placed in an imaginary three-dimensional space. The rules of narrative content, which I talked about earlier in the video False Rules of Composition, explained what not to do with objects inside the frame. Among them, there were no rules for organizing an image. But these rules exist, and I will tell you about them today. The narrative structure must first of all ensure the orderliness of the depicted objects to disclose the artist's concept. Let's list the tasks of narrative content organization. First, object placement within the frame. What should be trimmed and what should be shown in full. Second, accentuating the main figures and objects. Third, creating an environment for the main figures and objects using secondary ones. Fourth, show relationship and interaction between characters and objects. 5. Distribute objects by depth. What will be farther, what will be closer, and what will be blocked by a closer object. In narrative content, unlike composition, space has an imaginary depth. Let's consider how the problems of narrative content in relation to a multi-figure composition can be solved. For example, we have a certain plot what we want to organize. And in this plot, we have a number of figures. In this case, some figures should be main and others secondary. I will place a certain number of figures in this frame. When I have all the figures of the same size, of the same type, it is in no way possible to understand which of these figures is the main one and which is secondary one. And the first step that I can take is to somehow highlight the main figures. Let these be the two middle figures. Let's say they look at me, and all the other figures will turn the back of their heads toward me, and thus minor figures clearly attract less attention. And what do I get? There is not the slightest action in this arrangement of figures, but is absolutely nothing happens in the picture. In order to give life to the plot, I need to create some kind of action inside the frame. And if we take this same arrangement, this action can be shown in this way. The central figures are in side position facing each other, and they even make some hand gestures. You see, some kind of interaction is already emerging. The good thing about this option is that there is action, but it is completely unclear what kind of action it is, and the context of this action is not disclosed at all. What is happening there? We must decide what kind of action should take place here. Two main figures can be made, a lady and a gentleman, and the gentleman will invite the lady to dance. This could very well be a plot with interesting tension lines. We will place our characters again in the middle. The gentleman is slightly taller than the lady. He leans forward slightly to propose. The lady is slightly shorter than a gentleman. She looks down shyly. The gentleman extends his hand, and Our Lady is somewhat hesitant. Her hand is slightly moving forward, but she does not yet offer her hand to the gentleman to accept his invitation. So we have two main characters and some action between them. What will happen to the supporting characters? If our action takes place at a ball, we can show dancing couples in the background. One couple, the second couple, of the secondary characters, but we originally had there are two left. We will put them aside and they will talk to each other. Now we already have a definite plot, some intrigue has appeared, there is a context, but the action is poorly readable and the background does not work well. We can organize this whole scene in such a way that the central figures are tied into some kind of movement that is more clearly readable, and the supporting figures would support this movement so that it would all be connected through gestures, through the position of the figures into something unified. How can we do this? Well, firstly, we need a slightly larger frame so that we can clearly show where and what will be located. The first thing I will do in this case is to make the main figures much larger because even facial expressions are important here. For dancing supporting figures, it is important to show them in full height so that the dance movements are visible. But for the figures of the main characters, it is completely unimportant how their legs are positioned. It is much more important to show what emotions are on their faces. And this gives us a hint that the foreground figures should be much larger. So I make the foreground figures larger. Here is a gentleman, his head is larger, and everything else is also larger. Here is a lady, she looks down with her eyes downcast, but she is already going to accept the invitation and her hand moves a little forward. In a larger version, it is already possible to show emotions, which of course is necessary in this case. And in addition, gestures are much more clearly readable here. Due to the position of the bodies and hand gestures in the area of the main figures, a circular movement is created that unites them. Let's see what's going on with the distance figures and where they will be located. Let's say there are couples dancing here, somewhere here. Let's make that, and a little closer there is a couple talking. In order to organize all the figures as a single plot, they must be connected in some way. And I have a way to connect them. Let's see. The gentleman leans forward the lady bows her head in his direction, and thus it is clear that they are in a position of dialogue. And exactly this same position of the dialogue unites the talking background figures. The gestures of the main characters, their positions and tilts of their hands set a certain rhythmic component. I can repeat these gestures, although not literally in the movement of dancing couples. I can emphasize this same direction of movement in the position of their bodies, arms, and legs. In this way, I connect all the figures into one rhythmic whole through gestures. Creation of a coherent visual environment helps the viewer perceive the story as a whole. Now I'm about satisfied here, but I don't really like that in the field of the main plot tension between the main characters there are secondary figures, and it turns out that the action between the main characters is interrupted by distant figures. In some cases, this may make sense, but in this case, these figures simply bother me, and so that these figures do not interfere with me, I organize everything a little differently. I'll move the main figures a little to the right. Here I have a gentleman, here I have a lady. The background figures are dancing here. One couple, another couple. The talking figures lean toward each other, just like the main figures. Now we can designate the containing space. Some interior elements may be visible there, for example, some arches, some architecture. In general, what surrounds the characters. And in addition to the figures of the background, we may also have figures of a completely distant plan, which will look like a united merging mass. They do not participate at all, they simply create something like a lining on background. Now the narrative content structure has received a very definite form. It would seem that now we can start drawing this plot on the canvas. But this is where the stage comes when it is necessary to work out the composition and decide how the spots will work on the plane of the canvas. It is necessary to distribute the spots on the plane in such a way that they support the plot structure. We won't do this now. Later, I will make a separate video working on a compositional solution specifically for this plot. Let's summarize the work on narrative content. Now we can observe the patterns that emerged throughout this process. The placement of the figure within the frame sets the viewer's position in relation to the action. Figures shown in full suggested greater distance, while figures cropped by the frame bring the viewer closer to the action. If we do not see the entire figure, this creates a feeling of distance less than our height. Figures that are of primary importance can be accentuated by their position relative to secondary ones. In this case, they are highlighted by their central position and large size. The secondary figures are smaller in size, and in addition, they can be united in groups. The presentation of figures in groups suggests that not a single figure from this group can be something of primary importance. The interaction between characters can be shown through their position, through the direction of gestures, and as well as through the direction of their gaze, through facial expressions. The distribution of objects by depth sets a hierarchy, and in this case, the hierarchy is built very simply. The most important objects are closer to us, the least important objects are farther away. And finally, a little geometry. In this case, we applied circular movement in the position and gestures of the main figures. It implies stability, but at the same time, a readiness to move. This state is intermediate between static and dynamic. If we wanted to make them dynamic, we would arrange the shapes diagonally or even in spiral. To make the main figure static, we can use arrangements in a square or triangle. I am pleased to announce that now on Amazon, 2 of my books on artistic composition are available. The book Composition in Painting provides a new perspective on the topic of composition in the visual arts. In fact, this theory of composition is a game changer. It's a very clear and logical system that's easy applied in practice. And there is also a book Composition in Photography. The book is an attempt to explore how the rules of composition used in painting could be applied in photography. This is why the book is subtitled A New Approach. For those who are open to new ideas, there is a lot of interesting stuff. The links are in description below the video. Don't forget to subscribe, to give likes, and I'll be happy to read your comments. It's all for now. Have a good time. See you soon.